This is the second part of my earlier chronicle as far as the conflict in Mindanao is concerned. And so I was mentioning how Hashim Salamat began the Mindanao independence movement, influenced by what was happening in the Middle East at the time with the Palestinian liberation movement in the Middle East, with Palestinians wanting to break away from Israel and reclaiming Palestine back to themselves. So with that kind of an influence, that was how Hashim Salamat began his homilies, if you would call it that, his lectures. And you must understand also that even at that time, there were already the demarcation line between those that were in the royal families and those with royal blood and those that are peasants. Hashim Salamat was an ordinary man. He was a peasant, if you would go by the hierarchy of the way it was then. And the royalty and the leaders were, as I've mentioned already, the political leaders were the Matalams in Cotabato and the Pendatun, Salipada Pendatun, that was the senator. In the hierarchy of the Liberal Party during the time of President Diosdado Macapagal, they were lording it over as far as our places in Mindanao were concerned. For instance, you had Salipada Pendatun, who was practically number 3. You had Macapagal, you had Osmeña, and then you had Pendatun senators. So Pendatun was the one in Cotabato. And then in the Lanao provinces, you had Senator Dumocao Alonto and Senator Rashid Lucman. And they were liberals. So when Marcos came in this new administration in 1966, there was, of course, that division as far as the hierarchy of both parties are concerned. And that is why when Hashim Salamat was beginning his movement as far as the request or the movement to have Mindanao independent from the rest of the republic, the politicians cashed in a way. And they tried to use the demands of Hashim Salamat for political leverage. And they believed that by doing this, they could get the attention of Ferdinand Marcos, and it did. As a matter of fact, this came out in the newspapers at the time. They were invited by President Marcos to Cebu, the leaders then of both Lanao and Cotabato, so that they could have a dialogue and find out what is this independent movement that you're talking about, or that Salamat is talking about. And so there you had some kind of concessions given, because that was precisely all politicians go by this. What's in it for me? And so they were quieted for a while, in the sense that, now they can work with Marcos, because whatever it is that they could request of him, they could obtain this, so long as they would not be supportive of an independence movement. But it did not end there. You must remember that the way Hashim Salamat was explaining this to the rest of the masses of our place, a lot of people actually were thinking that since Mindanao was left by itself, for itself, to fend for itself, and most of the time it is very rare that they could get any benefits coming from the national government, then it best be that they be independent. So that is where it all began. And then in the Lanao provinces, some of the young rebels also began the influence that they had coming from Hashim Salamat. And there you had Abul Khair Alonto, and then you had Jamail Lucman. Of course, these were the two young, very young leaders of the rebel movement that we had in the Lanao provinces. But as I've said, they were supported by several Islamic countries overseas. And one of the countries that actually supported them quite strongly was Libya under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. But it took a while before we could confirm, or the national government could confirm, that there were actually a lot of shipment of arms and ammunitions and several support that was given by Libya itself, because this was done clandestinely from the port of Zamboanga, and then traveling to Cotabato City, and then this was traveling also to the Lanao provinces. So for several years, the armed forces was heavily, they were really heavily embattled as far as the fight was concerned. It all began with just a matter of a few skirmishes, the blasting of several bridges, and some attacks in several towns and several barrios. But it was what you could call, it was really quite dangerous in the sense, because then there were a lot of flags that were flying already, and the declaration for an independent Mindanao was all over. And so that was where President Marcos decided that it may be about time that we will have to settle this first with the Islamic Conference, but then at about that time, by 1972, when martial law was declared, what happened was Nur Miswari, who was an instructor, rather an assistant instructor at the University of the Philippines, he went back to his home province in Sulu. So that was where he also began his own independence movement together with the independence movement that was being declared by Hashim Salamat, the Alontos, and the Lukmans in the Lanao provinces. So you could see that that was where you had the birth of the MILF, but that was much later, as I've said, 1972, with the MNLF in the Lanao and Cotabato provinces, all of them being strongly supported by Libya. But how do we get to Libya? How is it possible to be able to explain to this leader in Libya who is supporting the independence movement in Mindanao? Well, through several dialogues that the president had. First of all was with the members of the Islamic Conference. I remember, I think that was Dr. Karim Gay from Africa who came over. And so President Marcos was able to arrange, is it possible for us to have a dialogue or to talk to Colonel Gaddafi? Because there is something that is happening in Mindanao which is really quite precarious as far as the entire country is concerned. It is having a heavy toll on our armed forces and, of course, on the lives of the people of the rest of Mindanao. So it happened that President Marcos said that since he could not travel at the time because a lot of things were happening in Manila. Remember, martial law was just declared 1972. So there had to be a lot of, many other things that he had to consider before he could travel overseas. And so he decided to send Imelda Romualdez Marcos, his first lady. At the time, there was hardly anything we knew about Libya except the material that we were getting from the Western media. How Gaddafi was demonized. He was a tyrant. He was a dictator. He was somebody very dangerous, and of course America hated him. And so there was, as I've said, very little that we knew about the man, and also very little that we knew about Libya itself. Because remember, Gaddafi took over the reins of government from his uncle. And that was how he became the supreme commander not only of Libya, but also his influence in Africa with the African states that were Islamized. So that was how powerful he was. Nonetheless, it was Imelda Romualdez Marcos that President Marcos decided to send to Tripoli. But she was assisted by a large delegation. We had members of the armed forces, from the judiciary, from the government, from the executive department, and from parliament. Remember, at the time we had parliament. And so it was a large delegation, thinking that, not thinking, but with the intent that there will be several discussions likewise that could be happening insofar as the details on how we can obtain peace in Mindanao. So it was actually supposed to be some kind of a very quiet, silent mission to Tripoli, because we were completely, the Philippine government is completely unaware what it was that they were going to face as far as Colonel Gaddafi was concerned. And indeed, that's exactly what Mrs. Marcos faced. So she landed in Tripoli, but for 3 days, Colonel Gaddafi did not consider at all meeting with her. Instead, we were part of the delegation. That is why I could relay this story quite, professionally in the sense, and personally because we were there. So what happened was we were toured to several of the ruins left by the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Greeks, and some of them the French, and several of the museums and several of the tourist sites of Tripoli. That was what we were doing for 3 days, actually going back and forth. And then Secretary Enrile, who was then the Secretary of National Defense, I think that time they were called ministers, and General Fidel Ramos decided that because for 3 days, everybody was just waiting for an audience with Colonel Gaddafi, something very wrong was happening. And so what they decided to do was, they told the president, they called up the President Marcos by long distance and said, we're going home. And so they left her. They left Mrs. Marcos. They went to Rome. And they said, we are diametrically opposed to Gaddafi, and there is no way that he's going to meet with us. But Mrs. Marcos decided that, how do I get to meet him? So she went, what she thought of was to go to the mother of Colonel Gaddafi. But then you know how it is in Islam. We don't know whether the father of Gaddafi had only one wife. So what she decided to do was to go to the father. Surely there was only one father. So, but the father was out there in the desert. So to fly to the desert. He was encamped in a big tent. As I've said, it was a very large tent. It was fully carpeted. They had chandeliers. And that was where Mrs. Marcos talked to the father of Colonel Gaddafi and said, you know, Colonel, sir, we have been here for 3 days and Colonel Gaddafi has not met with us. And she said, I have come to ask for peace in Mindanao because we understand that your son has been supporting a rebel movement. And so she explained this to the father of Colonel Gaddafi. Soon after, you know, we were entertained. We were served the menu that was one of the best that they had in Libya, whatever else you call it. What is this? Lamb. Yes, the way they cooked it in such a way. So there was actually a banquet that they offered to Mrs. Marcos at the time. As soon as it was over and on our way back to Tripoli, as soon as we got to the city, Tripoli is the capital of Libya. As soon as we got there, who meets us at the hotel of Mrs. Marcos? The Secretary of State of Colonel Gaddafi. And shortly that was Secretary of State Al-Treki. That was his name. In fact, we used to call him Tricky Treki because he was really very shrewd anyway. And then right behind him, coming into the room to receive Mrs. Marcos is Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. And the first thing Gaddafi said to Mrs. Marcos was, are you not afraid to be kidnapped? But that was because when Enrile and Ramos left, our airplane was diverted to Benghazi, which is about 8 hours away from Tripoli. And so even if Mrs. Marcos wanted to leave with at the time, she would not be able to leave because our aircraft was out there 8 hours away. So that was exactly what Gaddafi said. Are you not afraid to be kidnapped? And then Mrs. Marcos said, I will offer anything, even my life, in order to obtain peace for our country. And so that began. Gaddafi said, Islam is peace. And of course, let us talk about peace. And that is where he showed her the Quran and started to underline all the passages which talked about peace. Islam is a religion of peace. And that began that dialogue which led into the Tripoli Agreement signed between the two governments of Libya and the Philippines, granting autonomy to the two regions in southern Philippines, regions 9 and 12, 10 provinces and 5 cities. And so when that was finally done and a plebiscite was undertaken for the people to accept that they will be the autonomous regions, both Muslims and Christians living together, not separated, together in the two regions, but having the executive council led by a Muslim, which was Simeon Dato Manong, the late Simeon Dato Manong, and Abul Khair Alonto as the speaker of the assembly for the two regions. Anyway, that was how it was. So from 1977, after the plebiscite and the operation of the two regions, there was peace in Mindanao until 1986 when Mrs. Aquino came and then invited Nur Miswari to get into the Philippines. And that is where it all began again, when we had conflict in our island of Mindanao. That's just our chronicle for that time, because as you've said, I can speak of this firsthand because I worked in that regional autonomous government as the director for policy and programs. So